Hello and welcome to today's video. This is video 2 in my Back to Basics series, and today we're looking at mixing in the palette versus mixing on the page. So it's quite an interesting one. So we're going to be looking at thoroughly mixing in the palette, partially mixing in the palette, then a wet on wet technique which is done directly on your painting, and then the glazing technique as well. So you're going to learn a lot from this, and it sort of follows on from last week's video, which was all about mixing the primaries and creating your warm and cool colour wheels. So if you haven't seen that video, pop across and watch that one first. It's a really good one to get you started. So let's get straight into the video. Okay, so we're going to start by separating your page into 4 sections so that we can do the 4 different techniques of colour mixing that I want to show you today. So just take some masking tape and try and separate it in half one way and then half the other way. And you're also going to want to secure it on the outside to a board as well, or your tabletop, because we are going to be applying quite a bit of water and you don't want your paper to start buckling. That can be quite annoying. So by securing it to your board, that helps to prevent that from happening. I just wanted to show you the colour wheels from last week, so you can have those to hand as well if you want to. Just set them to one side, you can refer to that. But today I'm going to keep it simple, and we're looking at mixing green. So I'm going to be using my cadmium yellow and ultramarine blue, and they're both in the warm palette. So you can see I've got 2 patches of yellow already on my palette. Now this top left section, I'm going to be looking at mixing entirely on the palette a thoroughly mixed colour. So there's my yellow. Just going to grab some of the ultramarine blue and mix that thoroughly with the yellow that I have there. Just grabbing some of that lovely ultramarine blue and straight into the yellow. And what I'm going to do is thoroughly mix that in so that there's not any separated blue or separated yellow. They're entirely combined on the palette to make one shade of green. Okay, you can choose whatever 2 primaries you want, but I think this is going to work quite well to show you guys these different techniques. So I've got enough colour mixed on my palette to cover this entire section on my page. So I've got a large round brush, a number 10, and I'm going to apply this to the section at the top here, top left, just using left and right motions. So I haven't wet the paper, I'm just painting what we call wet onto dry. And you can see that that's a lovely flat colour. It's all the same consistency, it's a lovely green colour, and that's the first example that I'm showing you. Okay, so it'd be good for you to actually do this exercise. You'll get used to mixing in these different ways, and it'll just help you along the way. So because I've used ultramarine blue, this colour does have a tendency to split a little bit. So in the palette, when you're mixing it with another colour, it does tend to separate a little bit. So every time you use the ultramarine blue, and if you want a flat colour like this, you just need to come back to your palette every time you're adding more paint and just mix it up again. That's the first way of mixing on the palette. So that's just a normal, ordinary way of creating green. So the second way of creating green in the palette, if I bring it over to you a little bit, I'm going to take my brush, clean water, and come into the blue And this time when I'm combining the two, I'm going to not thoroughly mix it. So you can see there's some patches of blue, some patches of green and some patches of yellow. And what happens then is when you come to apply that onto the paper, you get these variations in green and it makes it more exciting. So if I mix up some more of my colour now. So there we go with the blue, and I already have yellow on this brush here, so bringing that yellow in, and again, like I say, not thoroughly mixing, we get these different, a bit more blue in there, you get a sort of a variation in that green across the surface of the paper. Every time you pick up more paint, it's a slightly different mix. And obviously if you have water on your brush, then it waters it down too. But it helps to create something a little bit more natural. And we'll just allow that to dry. And because it's being applied in one big area, any patches of colour will mix with the next. So you get this, like I say, variation of colour across the surface, which is quite nice. Okay, so that's the second way of mixing in the palette. So we've got a fully mixed section here, and then here we did the partial mixed, creating variations, and this one creates a lovely flat consistent colour. So in the bottom left section, I'm going to show you how to mix the green on the page, and this time it's going to be wet on wet. So I'm going to use the yellow to start, loading up my brush, fully loading my brush, and I'm going to paint the yellow. Bring that down. And then I'm going to pick up my blue brush, the Ultramarine blue. It's fully loaded. Again, a nice big brush. And I'm going to paint the green, the blue into the yellow and create the green. You can see they're mixing on the surface and creating a green. And this way, the paint, this is a lovely technique with watercolour because the paint does its own thing. It comes together. And you can create lots of texture using this technique. You can have the colours side by side. So if I go back into the blue here, so if I put a patch of blue down at the bottom here, and then quickly in next to it with my yellow, you can see that the two patches next to each other blend in the centre. So those two patches of paint just want to come together and mix to create that green. So if I paint that yellow there, and because the two areas are wet, they want to blend together. So that's the wet in wet technique. A couple of different ways of doing it. So you can create lots of texture by dabbing one colour into the other colour. You can also create a smooth area of paint if you want to actually smooth the colour out with the brush. You can create a smooth area, so that works as well. For shadows and things, if you wanted a light area blended into a shadow, you would paint the yellow and then come in with the blue and smooth it out with your brush. But you can see down here the patch of blue, the patch of yellow have come together because both areas are wet. The paint runs together and creates a green in that way. Now the final section is for what we call glazing. So again, this is where the colours are blended on the page. In a way, they're set in layers. So the first layer you paint down, so I'm going to obviously start with my yellow, and you place a nice flat wash of colour. I'm going to bring that colour all the way down to the bottom. Let's just add a little bit more water. Make sure I can cover that section. So firstly, you will have an area of yellow, and then you allow that area to fully dry. And once it's dried, you can come in with the blue over the top. So this is a wet on dry technique rather than wet on wet, but it's where the colours are brought together on the page rather than in the palette. And it's a lovely way of controlling the colours that you get. So I'm just going to rub off the excess paint around the edges to stop any cauliflowers from forming, because what happens is the paper starts to dry from the edges into the middle, and if it's got wet on the tape, paint on the tape, it will pull that paint, draw it into the painting on the paper, and you end up with these marks going down around the outside. So we call those cauliflowers. So if you just rub those off around the edge, allow that to fully dry, and then we'll come back and paint our first glaze over the top. Okay, so the yellow is thoroughly dry now, and I've prepared a very thin wash of the ultramarine blue, and I'm going to paint on a second layer. I'm going to leave the top section yellow just so that you can see the difference that the glaze makes. And the way to apply a glaze is really gently. You don't want to disturb the paint that's underneath, and you just want to come across left to right if you can and create that very smooth glaze over the top. Oh, oops, just went into my yellow there. Don't want to do that. Very smooth wash of blue across the top, and immediately I'm going to get my paper towel and just wipe up those excess areas of paint that's gone onto my tape, and I'll be left with a nice flat even wash. So that's with one layer of a blue glaze over the top of our yellow. I'm going to let that dry, and then I'm going to come back and paint a second layer on top. So each layer will affect the each subsequent layer will affect the ones below it. So the first layer of blue is now completely dry, and I'm going to paint another layer of blue as a glaze over the top of what we've done already. And let's get some blue on the palette. So something about the ultramarine blue, it is a paint that has very large paint particles, and therefore they're quite heavy, and they like to sink into the paper. The paper that I'm using is a knot paper, which means it's slightly textured. So you've got three types of watercolour paper. One is smooth, so totally smooth to paint on. The second is knot, and the third is rough. So a knot paper is halfway between a rough and a smooth, and I always recommend using a knot if you are a beginner. It's just a really good one to start with, and so the particles, the paint particles within the ultramarine blue are, like I say, quite heavy and large. So they like to sink into the dips of the paper, and it's called a granulating paint, which means, you know, exactly that. It sits into these little grooves, and you get variations in colour across a flat wash, and that's the reason why. So there are several different granulating paints, but ultramarine blue is one that I use. Obviously it's in my primary set, so I use it a lot. You can also get a granulating medium, which you can add to ordinary paints, and it's supposed to help create this kind of granular effect on the surface. Now I do have granulating medium, but I've not had a lot of success with it, so I need to do some more experimentations with that and maybe do a video for you guys. If you'd like to see that, actually, just give me a comment below this video and I'll get started on that one for you and see how we get on. So I've got my ultramarine blue on my paintbrush, and I'm just going to paint a third glaze over the top of the previous two, and you can see straight away how much darker that makes our green now. But you can also see how beautifully smooth that colour is. You know, it's a lovely way of controlling and getting a flat area of colour. And I'm going to show you some of my paintings to highlight these different mixing techniques and what you can achieve from them. So that's the third layer of paint. So we've got a glaze of yellow, first layer and glaze of the blue over the top, and then the third glaze with that lovely dark green there. So those are our 4 different mixing techniques. So we have created 4 different ways of mixing. The 2 at the top are mixing using the palette in a traditional sense, and these 2 at the bottom are mixing actually on the page itself while we're painting. So the top left, that's the thoroughly mix in the palette to create a flat consistent wash of colour. And this one is a partial mix in the palette. Remember, we started with the yellow, we added some blue, but we didn't actually give it a thorough mix. So every time you pick up your brush from the palette, it's got a different amount of yellow and blue on it, creating sort of a little bit of variation across that area. And it can give you, if you're working on a landscape, for example, it can give you a more realistic kind of look and effect in the end. So mixing on the page, we did wet on wet. We started off by painting the yellow first and then brought the blue in, and obviously you can get a real variated kind of pattern happening. You can control that very easily. And also down here I painted a patch of blue and then a patch of yellow next to it, and the 2, because they were both wet, wanted to mix together on the page, and it created the green colour for us. And then finally, looking at glazing, we painted the yellow in the background. That was the first layer of paint, and then we glazed a thin layer of blue over the top, and then finally a third layer of paint that was blue again over the top of those previous washes, and it created that lovely dark green in the bottom there. So I just wanted to show you some of the paintings and me using this technique, and what you can create from those. So I have a painting here, the rose. I actually did this week with my class, and I wanted to show you the wet on wet technique we used in the background. So I was using the same colours, the cadmium yellow and the ultramarine blue, and I mixed up 2 different greens in the palette. One was light, one was dark, and then I placed them down on a wet paper. So I pre-wet the paper with clean water, placed the light green here and then the dark green next to it, and they float together nicely. So I've got this variegated wash in the background, which is really nice. And then to create the depth in the rose itself, I used layers of glazing, which works really nicely to create the shadows and things like that. And then in this next painting, this lovely squirrel, we used the glazing technique on the branch here at the bottom. So patches of paint were then allowed to dry, and then we came in with a flat brush and painted further patches of paint across the top, and where they overlapped you can see that you've got these darker patches coming in. So that's the glazing technique and the effect you can create there. Just a quick draw your attention back to the colour wheels that we did last week. Obviously I'm doing a back to basics series. This was video 1 in that series where we created a warm and a cool colour wheel. If you haven't watched that video, then I'd recommend going back and taking a look at that. I'll put a link to it at the end of this video for you. But I wanted to just point out a few things. So people often talk about contrasting colours. So what that means is if you look at your colour wheel and you're painting with red, for example, and you want to create something with impact, you might consider using a complementary colour next to it. And what that means is something that's directly opposite on the colour wheel. So if I was painting with cadmium red, then I would be wanting to paint this green. So that's a mix of the cadmium yellow and the ultramarine blue here. So the two next to each other contrast each other, and they sort of zing and create more of an impact. And then if you look at colours that are next to each other on the colour wheel, if you want to create a painting that's harmonious and you know, it has a peaceful overall feel, you want to be looking at harmonious, or analogous is the technical term, analogous colours, and those are colours that are next to each other in the colour wheel. So we might want to use the yellow green, the yellow and the yellow orange, for example, to create a harmonious painting. And it's the same wherever you look on the palette. So you could use the blue purple, the blue and the blue green. They are next to each other on the palette, on the colour wheel, so therefore they're harmonious. They are analogous colours. So I hope that's given you a few extra tips. So in video 3 of my Back to Basics series, we're going to be looking further at those foundation skills. So we're going to be looking at the 3 different wash techniques. So you've got a flat wash, then you've got a graded wash and a variegated wash. And each one of those gives you a different look. So that's what we're going to be doing next week. I hope you'll join me then. Don't forget, give me a like if you've learned something from my video, and subscribe and hit the bell icon, and then every time I upload another watercolour video for you, you'll get a notification so you won't miss a thing. Take care, I'll see you next week.